Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Eddie Portnoy, and I am the academic advisor and director of exhibitions here at YIVO. Today we will be discussing Remembering Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, the recently released audio documentary and third installment of Those Who Were There, Voices from the Holocaust, a podcast created by Yale University's Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies. Remembering Vilna is a co-production of the Fortunoff Archive and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. For those of you who do not know YIVO, we are a very special place for the celebration, contemplation, and exploration of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture. Located in New York City, our library and archive contain over 24 million documents and over 400,000 books and periodicals. These resources are used by researchers from all over the world. We also have lots of classes on Yiddish language and culture, exhibitions, and public programs like this, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast library and archival collections. And we are very excited to have you all joining us today for this program. I'd like to introduce our guests for this evening. It is truly an all-star cast. In the middle is Nahani Rouse, who was the lead producer of the series Remembering Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. And she wove together the stories of Holocaust survivors that make up the tapestry of experiences in this 10-part audio documentary about Jewish life in Vilna during World War II. A McDowell Fellow, Nahani also hosts and produces Can We Talk?, the podcast of the Jewish Women's Archive, which explores the intersection of gender and Jewish culture. To Nahani's left is Eric Marcus. He is the co-producer of Those Who Were There, this podcast series drawn from Yale University's Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, which includes, obviously, Remembering Vilna. Eric is the founder and host of the award-winning Making Gay History podcast. He's also the author and co-author of a dozen books, including Making Gay History, Is It a Choice?, Why Suicide?, and Breaking the Surface, the #1 New York Times best-selling autobiography of Olympic diving champion Greg Louganis. To my left is Eleanor Risa, the host of the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, Those Who Were There. She is a Tony Award-nominated director, an actor who has appeared on Broadway, television, and in film. She is also an award-winning playwright, choreographer, and critically acclaimed singer in English and Yiddish, having performed in every major musical venue in New York City and in festivals throughout the world. Her poignant book, The Letters Project, A Daughter's Journey, was recently published by Post Hill Press. And last but not least, at the end, Samuel Kassow is the Charles H. Northam Professor of History at Trinity College. He was on the team of scholars that planned the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. Among his many publications are Who Will Write Our History?, Emanuel Ringelblum and the Secret Ghetto Archive, which received the Orbis Prize of the AAASS, the Damals Prize in Germany for the Best Monograph of the Year, and which was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award. It has been translated into 8 languages. Professor Kassow provided historical oversight and researched and wrote the copious episode notes for this podcast series. And if you haven't yet listened to the podcast, I really recommend it. It is incredibly well rendered and incredibly informational and really worth the time. Now, I think I'll just start with Eric and Nahani, and either of you can take these questions. I'm just curious to know what the genesis of this project was. How did it start, and how did it take shape?
Well, this is the 3rd season of the podcast called Those Who Were There. The first 2 seasons take one Holocaust survivor's story and distill it into a narrative arc. And then for the 3rd season, we wanted to tell the story of a place and a Jewish community in that particular place. And Vilna was a place that we chose partly because of its fascinating history during World War II, and because it was such a thriving and important center of Jewish culture, and because of YIVO's connection to Vilna. YIVO was founded in Vilna in 1925. So that was the initial impetus.
And just to clarify, the first 2 seasons we did 10 individuals each. In fact, Sam is one of the episodes that we did in season 2. Yeah. This project started out as a 6-episode series. It's an audio documentary, and it was meant to take us a year, and that was 2 years ago.
And it also turned into 10 episodes.
Plus a preview and an introduction. And for the preview, we visited with Eddie here at YIVO
Last summer.
A year ago this summer.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, a year ago this summer. And Eddie gave us a tour. It's an extraordinary, the archives are unbelievable. I don't think we had any idea what a steep climb this would be.
Should we describe a little bit more of how the content of the,
Yeah, I think it might be of value to talk a bit about the Fortunoff archive and it, as it was initially created, and then what you managed to do with the contents of it.
So the Fortunoff archive was founded in the 1970s. It contains more than 4,000 recorded testimonies from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. I think I've got that correct. Most of the interviews that we drew on were from the 80s and 90s, from here in the US and around the world. Our process was to draw from that archive for this series interviews, or I should say testimonies, that were provided by people who lived in Vilna, Vilna, Poland, now Vilnius, Lithuania. Most of those testimonies were given in English. Some of them were in Hebrew. And in fact, one of the voices, when you listen to the series, you will recognize Eddie Portnoy, who did voiceover for one of the Hebrew testimonies. So the big lift was when we asked Stephen Nairn, who's the executive director of Fortunoff, to provide us with options. And then these testimonies had to be listened to. They're 2, 3, 4, and more hours.
Some of them are actually 12 hours long, and even 24 hours long. I listened to 60 of those testimonies. I didn't listen to all 24 hours of any one of them, but from those 60 testimonies, we chose several that we would weave together to tell a chronological account of the events in Vilna before, during, and in the immediate years after the Holocaust. And the other element of this storytelling is the diary of Herman Kruk, who was the librarian in the Vilna ghetto who kept an almost daily account of events in the ghetto. So we've also pulled excerpts from his diary and woven them together with excerpts from the testimonies.
And those excerpts are voiced by an actor. And that was a big challenge for us. We hadn't done that kind of work before, where we had other people voice in English. And it worked out well. Most of them are actors. Eddie, you're the only non-actor we had.
I think you could tell.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
But I will say that what was really kind of incredible to me was the way that you took all of these, at this point it's audio, but all of these video testimonies and distilled them into a really cohesive narrative. To me, that's an art. It's a huge amount of material, and in order to create, something that really flows is something really special. And I really appreciated that as a listener.
I wish we had a picture for you that we could show you of one day when Nahani and I realized we had to meet in person in Washington. Nahani lives in Washington, I live in New York, and we had Post-its across the French doors of Nahani's dining room, mapping out each episode, where the clips were going to go, and that was already late in the process. It was taking this vast mass of material and employing these individual stories to tell the bigger story of what happened in Vilna from before the war, during the war, and after the war.
Right. And, I want to bring Sam and Eleanor into this. Both of you work with Holocaust-related materials in a variety of different ways. And so I'm just wondering how, you were brought into this process and, what was expected of you and how you handled it, having to deal with the, audio or audiovisual materials.
Well, I was asked to write the historical notes and to provide historical context. So I was able to kind of use the fact that I had a pretty good knowledge of the various sources of the history of Vilna before the war, the history of Vilna in the ghetto. And so having read the transcript of the podcast, I then tried to kind of tailor the notes in such a way that for each week the listener would have some kind of historical background. Now, in the nature of things, the testimonies that you have at the Fortunoff Archive are the testimonies of people who were very young in the ghetto. They were teenagers. Had they not been teenagers, their chances of survival would have been much less. But because of the group that survived, there's a whole stratum of people in the Vilna ghetto who, of course, would not have been able to give their testimony. And so one of the challenges of writing the notes was to fill in the gaps and to provide a background of the ghetto that those testimonies could not have provided, because none of those people were directly involved in the leadership of the key organizations. I mean, some were in the FPO, the partisan organization, but they were not in the leadership strata. They were not in the leadership of the Jewish police or the leadership of the workshops. They were not close to Jacob Gens. By the way, the woman who ran the food store on my corner for many, many years in West Hartford was Jacob Gens' daughter, Ada. And so she and I had a lot of talks. And I don't know if she was ever interviewed by the Fortunoff. But so what I saw my role as, say, building on the testimonies and kind of provide a little bit of a historical background.
And just to note, Jacob Gens was the head of the ghetto police.
Yeah.
That's, I just want to point out that Sam's notes are available on the website of the Fortunoff Archive, and they're sort of part and parcel of the podcast series, and they're incredibly useful for background information. If you're listening to the podcast and want to find out more.
Yeah, because you can listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, or you can listen through the website at thosewhoarethere.org, and that's where Sam's notes are, and that's where the full transcripts are. And eventually there'll be a lot of photographs. We'll be adding those over time.
Yeah, the notes are invaluable. I mean, I hadn't really looked at them until recently, and they just fill in all the gaps and paint all the pictures that the testimonies just don't quite manage to do. So they're really great, Sam.
Right, and Eleanor,
I'm like the opposite of Sam.
okay.
I'm not an academic, but I'm attached to the Holocaust personally, and it's colored all of my work in the theater and in music and in Yiddish, and for the last 45 years. And finding myself in those who were their voices from the Holocaust is was for me enormous good fortune. And I knew Eric socially, and there were going to be auditions for the host. And I thought, I really have to get this. This is my job, this being the host of Voices from the Holocaust is something that I feel at home, and that it's my job to welcome people into this world. And sometimes we collaborate a little bit on text, and but I have an eye to it, and my Nahadi and Eric let me play with them in this, which I appreciate enormously.
To my mind, there was only one person who could be the host of this
Mine
series.
too, to mine too, but there was this other guy.
But I had to know there
Yeah.
were two. There
Oh,
were two other people who auditioned, and I made sure that they were people who wouldn't get it. Don't tell them that.
No. I think, yeah, no.
But I thought there was nobody else, and we have Elaine Stritch to thank for the introduction. We met at the Cafe Carlisle, sitting next to each other at an Elaine Stritch concert, I should say, and became fast friends. Yeah, 20 years ago, or something like
Right.
that. Yeah. Should we bring in some of the voices?
Yeah, I was going to ask, what was it like to work with audio, but maybe we should hear some of the clips.
Let's hear some of the
and,
clips. Yeah.
All right, so Eddie, can we have clip number 1?
We should set
All
it
the
up.
people
sorry, go
who
ahead.
were
I'm sorry, can we wait 1 second?
Why don't you set it up?
Yeah, so this is, the first clip is from chapter 2. At the beginning of the war, the Soviets occupied Vilna for a period of time. And during these occupations, and then reoccupied it again right before the Nazis came in. And during these occupations, many people were deported. So in this is probably one of the only clips that has a tinge of humor in it. This is William Begel, whose father served in the Polish military, and his family also owned hotels and businesses. So they were fearful that they would be among those arrested. And his father actually had been arrested
Because
already by the
they were the
Soviets.
bourgeoisie.
Right.
Yeah, so they were
So
targets. Yeah.
That's the context for this clip.
all the people who were bourgeois at one time or another and considered anti-communist were being sent to the Soviet Union. We were absolutely sure that we will be sent out. At that time, we were told that if and when the KGB comes in to deport you to Siberia, and you are ready with packages and suitcases, they say, aha, you knew that you're going to be deported, therefore you're doubly guilty of being oppressors of the working class, or whatever epithets they used. You can take nothing with you. So we had things prepared, and we went through packing drills that my father conducted, so that when the Russians came in and said, you have 10 minutes to pack, everybody knew what to take and where to pack, and etc. We were prepared to be taken to Kazakhstan or Siberia. However, our turn did not come, because the Germans came first.
Many people in their testimonies expressed that at the time everybody felt sorriest for those who were deported and taken deep into Russia and Siberia. But then in retrospect, they realized that those were actually the lucky ones.
Yeah, that's true. So in connection to, these testimonies, I'm wondering how you went about, what was the process of choosing, which testimonies worked best? There are a lot of stories, many of them are harrowing. I'm just curious how that process played out.
Well, I'll say that, every single one of the stories in the Fortunoff archive is important and worth telling, and they just don't all work in the audio medium. So what we were really looking for were stories that come across in an immediate kind of feeling way. Like, one of the things I love about working with archival material is it's sort of this double leap back in time where you're present in the 1980s while this person is telling their story to an interviewer, sometimes for the first time, and then you're also with them as they describe the events in the 1940s. And what I'm listening for when I'm listening for a story that works well in audio is somebody who really feels like they are in the moment that they're describing, that it's not something that they've told so many times before that they've got a little bit of a distance from it. And then the other thing that I was looking for in this particular series is people who are really kind of grounding their stories in the place in Vilna, so that they had a connection to the community. They described Vilna because we were looking to construct, we were looking to provide a window into this unique moment in time in this place that can, never be created again. And so it wasn't just the person's individual narrative, but it was kind of the collective that we were looking for.
If you go to Vilnius now, as we did, and had Eleanor Nahani and I were there this September, you will know from the series, you will know Vilna, you'll know Vilnius. It's actually the story is much more horrible being there and being in those places because it's so intimate and it's so small. It wasn't the kind of thing where you could ignore what was happening. Vilnius is not a big city. It had to be vivid, these stories, and so many people who tell stories about the past tell it at a remove. That doesn't work in an audio story. And Nahani was brilliant at choosing people whose stories worked. We're storytellers. Audio documentary is storytelling. So there were a lot of people whose stories and testimony didn't fit because of the way they gave testimony, the way they recalled things. And almost everything was left on the cutting room floor in the end, which was very painful.
Yeah, I mean, I assume that while listening, I assume that there were parts that you didn't include that you just weren't able to.
Like almost nothing. What percentage would you say, Nahani, of the 60, you listened to 60, we included 13 plus Herman Kruk, and of the 13, what percentage of the audio made it in?
I mean, less than 10%, 5%?
Maybe
Maybe
less.
Even less?
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
even less.
Yeah, and that's the nature of storytelling.
But for our fourth series, our next series, we are taking some of those individual stories and presenting them in full. Each episode will be one person's narrative arc, so you will be able to follow their story from beginning to end, which sometimes is hard to do in the Vilna series because they're all woven together. And when I say their stories start to finish, it's also never their full story. It's always, parts of the story, because in a 25-minute episode, you can't possibly even scratch the surface of what people went through.
And even in their 3-hour or 4-hour testimonies, it's only a fraction. Should we listen to another clip?
Sure.
And Nahani, why don't you set this up?
Okay, this is from chapter 3, the beginning of the Nazi invasion in the summer of 1941, when restrictions and violence against Jews began almost immediately. Some of the survivors talk about sexual violence, and we felt that this is a topic that's not commonly discussed, and it was important to include it. So this is Vera Goldman.
They used to come in, the Germans, at night and rape young girls. They used to come at 5, 6 o'clock looking for young girls. We used to dress up like old ladies. We used to hide in the cellar. My aunt, where she had a house, her cellar was under the dining room table, and she had a big carpet. So when we heard noise, we ran to the cellar. They shouldn't find us. One night, they knocked on our door to open them. And we lived on the first floor. And my mother said, "Jump, get out." And I jumped, and I went out in the bushes. And my mother was a brave woman. They walked in and they said, "Where's your older daughter?" And my mother said, "This is my 2 kids, I don't have any children." "Oh yes, you have." And they wrecked the whole house. And they touched my sister, was 3 years younger than me, and she said, "Don't touch the kid. If you want to touch me."
I mean, I did mention earlier that many of these stories are harrowing, and I think that when working with material like this, there's an emotional toll that's taken. And you know, Eleanor and Sam, you've worked with this material for much of your lives, and I'm just wondering how you handle that, how you work with it, and how do you craft it into either historical narrative or art? How does that process transpire?
For me, it's kind of documenting. I'm in service, and I have a responsibility to do the text and present it and welcome people into it in a way, using whatever craft I have. But invariably, we'll go through an episode or 2 episodes, and and you hear the testimony, and you say, and I have to say things, recounting some of the terrible things that happened, and invariably, at some point, even I, who am fairly inured, but I guess I'm not, the whole thing weighs, and I break down, and we have to stop. And it's a funny thing at what breaks me down. I mean, in Vilna, I remember we were doing one of the last episodes, and I had to read who was responsible for this, and it included YIVO and you and Sam, and it was that. Actually, it was connecting the past to the present that, like all of us together, just the life is also what's moving, that everybody in this testimony is not, I mean, they are dead, but they aged out. And they, in other seasons, we would read, I'd have to say what happened to someone, and so someone who was in Auschwitz or was this or that, and at the end of the episode, we say that they live in Passaic and have 5 grandchildren and 22 great-grandchildren, and that's enough to stop me, because we're just sort of doing accounting, and then it's, the reality is so moving. So.
I remember, Eleanor, when you were just describing reading the credits, we were in Vilnius at the National Library of Lithuania.
We had been to Ponar the day before, and
where tens of thousands of people were murdered, And we were at the National Library in their studio recording. They were very kindly offered their studio because you were in Berlin shooting a new TV series, and because of the timing, we had to record you in Vilnius. And you said at the time that the connection of being in Vilna, reading the narration for an episode, the final episode of our season, about what happened in this place, it was overwhelming, I think, for all of us. But it got you.
And Sam, I mean, obviously you are a scholar who's been dealing with this material for many years. The depth of your knowledge is incomparable. I mean, but you also have a familial connection to Vilna. I'm just wondering how you manage to sort of distance yourself, or if you don't, in regard to these kinds of emotional matters.
I've kind of had two careers, which the first half of my career as a historian, I had nothing to do with Jewish history or the Holocaust. I just said, I'm not going to deal with it. I did Russian history, which of course was nice and calm and happy. And so, and then after my parents passed away, I found myself getting kind of drawn into it. I felt that I owed an obligation to the survivors, and because so much of the history outside of Israel was the history of the perpetrators, and the victims didn't have names. They were just victims. And so that led me to the Ringelblum archive. But I find that I have to distance myself from it. I think, being a child of survivors and being, there are certain things that I came to know that are not common knowledge. For example, in the survivor community, you could whisper that somebody might have been a capo, or that somebody might not have behaved well in the ghetto, or that somebody should have done something that they didn't do, or vice versa. But the one taboo was the fact that, most young women, especially in the Vilna region, who made it to the partisans, the only way they could survive was to have a boyfriend. You had to, make that calculation. Otherwise, you were toast. You didn't have a chance. And I noticed that that was the taboo. No one talked about it. You came out of the war, you went to the DP camps, you started a family, and nothing about who you slept with or what you had to do to survive during the war. And that obviously was relevant to the story of my mother. And then, of course, I found out from listening to the testimonies, and then actually in documents in Yad Vashem, that before the liquidation in the ghetto, when she was a cleaning lady in the German commandants, the police chief got really drunk. He was a Volksdeutsch, he was not a Reichsdeutsch, and he tried to assault her, and she slapped him in the face. And he had her beaten with hoses all night. And then in front of the ghetto, he put a pistol to her head and said, I want you to apologize for slapping me. And she said no. And he put a pistol right to her head and pulled the trigger. And then he had her dumped into the latrine. And she was only 18 years old. And, this is not an uncommon story. Young Jewish women suffered a terrible amount of abuse, which is not talked about. They really didn't want to talk about it. And, I don't want to be a downer here, but when I read about what happened on October 7th, there are a lot of triggers. That same need to humiliate, that same need to wring every last bit of humiliation out of the victims, and the fact that women's organizations in the UN and elsewhere don't say a word about it.
Yeah, it's been terrible, and I do see the triggers. But you know, one thing you point out here is that the history up until a certain point was about the perpetrators, and that putting names and faces to the victims and giving them, you know, the type of historical record that they deserve is part of what this podcast really does. You know, you really feel these people and their stories.
When I was growing up in Kew Gardens, Queens, which is a neighborhood with many survivors and refugees, what we were taught was about the 6 million, which is very hard for a child to grasp. And often it was the rabbi at my synagogue and at Hebrew school who would, if we were misbehaving, would say, 6 million died, you should behave. And so it's very hard to grasp 6 million people being killed. I like to think that what we have done collectively is to humanize, in a very painful way, but also a very honest way, humanize the experience of the Holocaust, which is such a big subject. It takes it down to a level that is digestible. Not that we whitewash the experiences, because we don't. Although we certainly had discussions about how much horror to include, because there's just so much one can absorb. And I really hear Sam when he talks about keeping distance, because I couldn't do this work without a certain level of it. But then listening to the final version of episode 10, and Eleanor sings. You have to hear. You have to listen to all the episodes, and so that you're prepared for the last, and to listen through to the credits at the end, and then Eleanor sings the Vilna Vilna, which is the song that's the theme of the series, and Eleanor sang it at the National Library in Lithuania, and it's compelling. I think we should listen to more.
Sure.
May I set this up? Yeah, so this is from chapter 3. The Nazis also enlisted local Lithuanians to do some of their dirty work. And this is a montage of 4 voices talking about the Lithuanian groups who rounded up the Jews. The first is in Hebrew with an English voiceover. Some of the people were taken for work. The majority were taken to the forest of Panari and shot.
תוך כמה ימים התחילו לתפוס יהודים.
Within a few days, they started kidnapping Jews. Jews would go out of the houses and just not come back. Sometimes they would take groups of people to various working assignments, and then they would return them at night.
This was a special Lithuanian police. In Lithuanian, they called Ypatinga. In Yiddish, we call them the chapas, the people, the catchers.
Chapunes, they call them. They used to go to the houses and grab men. I mean, they told them they take them for work. They should take a towel with soap. They took them away to jail.
My father was 41 years old, and they took him away. And they took him to the jail, and somebody told us that they are taking out the men to work.
And they didn't, most of them. I wonder if we should just listen to the next one as well. This is the next 2 we should? Yeah.
One of my friends lived in the street on Strashuna, where I used to come a lot to her also and do the homework with her. Her mother was a widow and she had 2 daughters, and they lived in the street. So when they brought us to the ghetto, I thought naturally I'll go to Myra's house because I'll feel comfortable there. I walk up to the apartment and I'm asking where they are. The Myrons are, where are they? They're not there. I'm asking people. The night before, they took out the whole street of Jews, put them against the wall and shot them.
We should explain that the ghetto was formed out of a small section of the poorest part of the city, the old Jewish quarter, and to make room for the people who were forced into the ghetto, they took out all the original inhabitants and killed them. And this was Henny Dumashkin Gurko, who was a child, hoping to see her friend. And later in her testimony, she talks about the jams and jellies that her friend's mother had prepared, and she felt guilty for eating them, but they were hungry. The next clip, do you want to can you set that one
Sure,
up?
this is another clip about the journey into the ghetto, being forced into the ghetto. It's Samuel Bach, who was just 6 years old at the time. And his memories are very vivid. He became a painter, and his storytelling is very, it's like painterly, like the details that he pulls out and describes. Go ahead.
And then I remember very well, on a very rainy day, the police came, German police and Lithuanian police, and they told us to take a suitcase, something that we could carry, and to go down, and that we had to leave the apartment. And my mother started to, in a very panicky way, to take things and put in a small suitcase, and then there was not enough place in that suitcase, so she took another one. And she took my hand, and we walked through the door of the apartment, and then she remembered all of a sudden something, and she ran back and she took a pillow from the bed. So she took the suitcase, me, and the pillow. And we went down, and then in the courtyard of this big apartment house, there were many of our neighbors that were Jews standing there, all quite amazed and uncertain of what was going to happen. It was raining, and somewhere we were getting soaked, and nobody really thought about opening an umbrella or so. And when they have brought down all the Jewish occupants of that apartment house into the courtyard, we were told to go into the street. And there I saw a sort of a caravan of people walking on the road, because we were not permitted to walk on the sidewalk. And on the road, near the sidewalk, of course, with this enormous rain, it was full of water, and everybody was walking in the water. And they were just walking, you know, like a procession, everyone carrying something. And I had the pillow in my hand, and this pillow became more and more soaked, and it started to become so terribly heavy that at a certain point I threw it away.
That pillow, for me, and Nahani knows that I said we have to, that scene has to be in the series, is so iconic to me, of this little boy carrying the pillow but not being able to hold it anymore. One of the wings of the Jewish Museum in Vilnius is named for Samuel Bach. He's still alive, he's 90 years old. You got to meet him recently. His paintings are amazing. And he is one of the most vivid storytellers of all the people in the series.
Yeah, in reference to that, I wanted to ask, you know, especially Eleanor and Sam, when you were working with this, were there any stories that struck you in particular as being particularly memorable? And there's really a plethora of them. But, you know, if you know, do you recall anything in particular that was, you know, very striking?
There were so many. I mean, I probably at this moment can't think of one, although in episode 10, William Bagel, just his way of speaking, that's the other thing about these people who lived through that time. They each have their own rhythm and their own language and the way they see it. And I think the word is dispassionate, is that when you don't show much emotion, and here's this guy saying these things And I think he says at the end that I didn't cry or something. I didn't cry. And he takes a beat or two, and he doesn't cry, but inside, in his pause, in his beat, you hear an eternity of unadmitted, talk about trying to keep a distance or trying to not let yourself go into the river of horror or the river of tears or whatever that would be. So, yeah. But there were so many. I mean, I've done 3 seasons, so.
Sam, did you have any comment on that?
Yeah, there were so many stories, but one story that really stood out. It didn't take place in the ghetto. It took place where I think it was Mira Verblin. They went into the forests, and when they met the Soviet partisan brigade, they were disarmed, and then they were told to come in one by one and give up their valuables for the Soviet war effort. And of course, those valuables were simply pocketed by the partisans. Now that made a really big impression on me because my uncle Zalman was in that partisan unit and he saw it. And here you have these young Jews who with so much effort procured weapons and who dreamt that once they got to the Soviet partisans, they'd be treated with respect and they would be given a chance to fight and they would redeem the honor of Jewish Vilna, and they were treated like garbage. There were people like Shperka Kaczerginski, who of course is not in this episode, but they began to understand that what the Nazis failed to finish, the Soviets would pick up right where they left off. Not directly murdering Jews physically, but murdering what was left of their culture.
Right, I remember that particular episode where they talked about the anti-Semitism within the partisan movement. It's depressing because it's not what anyone expected. As we're running out of time, so we do want to take a few questions from the audience. So if anyone does have questions, not necessarily comments, but questions, we'd be willing to take them.
I have just a quick question. I happen to have been an interviewer for the Shoah Foundation, that Spielberg had started. And I wonder, are these interviews part of that group or that you selected, or these interviews were done by some other organization?
It's a separate archive. The Fortunoff Archive is housed at Yale University.
But
And
Fortunoff, they do have the 50,000, I think.
They do not. Fortunoff has a relationship with Shoah, and Shoah has a relationship with Fortunoff. It's a separate archive.
They were first, weren't they?
Fortunoff
Yes.
was first, yes. Shoah was copycats. Fortunoff was the first.
Well, I know Margie Fortunoff pretty well. I know the Fortunoff family.
I just wanted to know if it's linked with Yad Vashem or not at all. Is there any link with Yad Vashem or no?
We don't know. I assume that there's a professional relationship between all of the organizations, but I don't know.
I mean the interviews.
Are these interviews at Yad Vashem, or no?
Yeah. Either is it shared, or do they have? Do they interview the same people differently, or something?
There are some people who were interviewed by the various archives who were interviewed more than once. The way the Fortunoff archive works is that there are various places in the U.S. and around the world, access points, where you can go and listen to these testimonies. Is YIVO one of the places where people who can make appointments to access interviews?
Well, we don't have an archive of interviews.
I meant for Fortunoff.
I mean, the Fortunoff interviews are available online, so there may be a link on YIVO's website. I'm not sure, but
Sorry, we are not good at answering that question.
yeah, in theory, there could be a sort of consortium agreement between all of these organizations, and there probably should be, so that people can access all of these materials in one place. So that may be a very good idea, so thank you.
For all the work you do and for sharing this with us tonight. There was a word mentioned, and I detected knowing glances among some of the panel members in one of the audio
A
excerpts.
chopper.
Yes.
A chopper, a grabber.
Oh, a chopper, that's
That's
what
what they were saying.
It was chopperness.
It was chopper.
So what were they referring to?
They were stealing people. They were chopping. They would chop people and kidnap them, but it's sort of amusing, darkly amusing
Baruch
to call
Hashem.
them choppers.
I'm from a survivor home, and I remember growing up hearing about chaptzim, which is the reverse of that, when people would start up in a Hasidic neighborhood. So the young men would gather and make a chaptzim. They would grab the
non-religious and bring them
they were
in.
non-religious.
Yeah.
Someone who was attacking, who was being violent. So.
This was early. The grabbers were early on, before the organized efforts to destroy the Jews of Vilna. They just would grab people randomly, Jews on the street.
One of the topics that demands a lot of attention, and there's going to be a conference on this in Israel in June organized by Hannah Poland Galai, is how the Yiddish language changed at lightning speed in the ghettos and in the concentration camps. You have this unprecedented catastrophe, and how does a language change to reflect this trauma? And so you had many, many Yiddish words that just developed overnight. Chaper, Malina, Shabreven.
Well, what do those mean? What's Malina and
A
Shabreven?
Malina is a hiding place. Far Malinoven is to hide something. Zu Shabreven is when Jews have been deported from an apartment, and you go into the apartment and you grab the possessions of the people who were deported. Is it immoral? Is it moral? Are you doing the right thing? There were all kinds of arguments. Another word, the Einik Shabbos Archive actually coined new Yiddish words to describe a new reality, like refugees were the Platim, but the Jews who were forced by the Germans to leave their shtetls and were dumped in the Warsaw Ghetto, they weren't Platim, they were called Goylim, the exiles. And right after the war, Israel Kaplan from the Kovna Ghetto put out a book of expressions from the ghettos and camps. Nachman Blumenthal did the same thing, Shmerka Kaczerginski, and now Hannah Poland Galai is writing a book about this. And I know this was not possible, this could never have been possible, but in the next world, if they have a Fortunoff archive in the next world, if all the interviews could have been done in Yiddish or in the native language of those people, I think you would have gotten a very different affect. Again, listening to my mother's testimony in English, it's a very different person in English than it would be in Yiddish. She's much more polite in English. Yeah. Some, not very many.
Can we, I know we're about to wrap, can we listen to the last, it's number 8?
Sure, why don't we close with
It's
that?
number 8, and this is, to close, we're sharing a segment that has gained new resonance for us because the three of us, and you've been there too, Sam, of course, we had just visited, the forest where tens of thousands of people were murdered, most of them Jews. It's called Panari, and in this clip, Chaim Bosak describes going to visit the site with a group of Jews after Vilna was liberated. He speaks in Hebrew. The voiceover is Claiborne Elder. So it's number 8, Chaim Basok. Are you able to find it? It's number 8, Chaim Basok, B-A-S-S-O-K.
אנחנו יצאנו לשם בכמה מכוניות מסע של הצבא האדום.
We traveled in Red Army trucks. We were crowded in, standing up, but each in our own world, preparing to witness that gate to hell. We passed the exclusive neighborhoods of Vilna. We passed the Zakrati woods, where people would go on vacation, and through a village called Ponari. We spotted it from a small grove in the woods. We saw a barbed wire fence, and we found ourselves on the edge of one of the pits. It was a deep pit with a huge perimeter, many meters across, sand. We went down. It was a field of bones, ground up bones. We saw parts of hands, leg bones, people's scalps that were sticking out of the sand. The entire area was sown with bones ground to dust. The golden sand and the bones were mixed together like one substance. It was 2 months after Vilna was freed. There were only trees, bushes. Birds were chirping as if nothing happened. Nobody talked. We were each in our own thoughts. We were stepping on the bodies of our relatives, maybe brothers, grandparents, friends. We didn't know what was going on within ourselves. I think we were almost hallucinating. The sun was at its fullest. It was around noon. We didn't see the sun. I don't know if I cried. It was hard to know whether you were crying hysterical or frozen, or in a dream, running crazed as if you could find anyone alive. Someone recited Psalms by heart, and they said Kaddish in a heartbreaking cry. I've never seen a Kaddish like that. The crowd of men and women, everybody standing together. When we returned to Vilna, our eyes were red from crying, as if blood flowed instead of tears.
That visit to Ponar Forest happened on the eve of Yom Kippur 1944. And when Chaim and the others returned to Vilna, they went for Kol Nidre services in the ruins of the Great Synagogue. And they had to pray in the dark because there were rolling blackouts.
So you could see the intensity of this documentary, this audio documentary.
I just want to say something about the documentary that occurs to me often or enough. Nobody wants to listen. It's a hard listen. It's a tough thing to walk into by yourself or willingly walk into, and you think one thinks to oneself, I think to myself, I know this, and you don't know it, and even I don't know it, and it's enormously worthy. It's enormously worthy to hear these individual humans and the stories that they tell, even though it's a tough listen. It's an enormously worthwhile listen. I just wanted to say that because it's a hard sell. I mean, but the loss you'll miss it. It's your loss if you don't hear it. It's not them. It's our loss that that you're sitting, no offense, with us instead of with them. And this gives you a chance to sit with them.
You go ahead.
I think one of the main things that motivated me in this is that all of these people had the courage to give their testimonies, and I want to bring them to more people so that more people can hear them, so that they're not locked somewhere in an archive, because it took so much for them to just get in that chair behind the microphone to share this. So that's why I want people to listen.
Yeah, and it's incredibly worthwhile, and it's an incredibly valuable resource that they've created. It allows these stories to cohere into a larger narrative, and it's I think so useful to teach the lessons of this tragedy in a way that is, I won't say it's entertaining, but it has a narrative flow that makes the listening digestible in a way that you wouldn't normally expect. So unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Sam, Eric, Nahani, and Eleanor, and I'd like to thank you for coming. Please go to wherever you find your podcasts and download Remembering Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, as part of the Voices from the Holocaust of the Fortunoff Archive at Yale University. So thank you.
Thank you, Eddie, for having us.